So the title of my talk, it's actually sort of two talks, and I'll explain in a minute. It's human evolution and creation, chance, order, and purpose. And to frame this talk and what I'm going to try to do, I think this quote from Benedict sets us up very, very well. And this is a quote from his inaugural homily when he became Pope in 2004. Right? And this quote sets up sort of the dichotomy that people often perceive between evolution and the Catholic understanding of creation, right? And so the quote says, we are not some causal and meaningless product of evolution. Each of us is the result of a thought of God. Each of us is willed. Each of us is loved. Each of us is necessary. And you can see in that first line there sort of what people often interpret when they think of evolution. If we've evolved, then there must be no meaning or purpose to our existence. And that doesn't quite fit with the understanding that God knows us and loves us and plans us from all eternity. Now, that's certainly not how Benedict views evolution, as you guys have read in the beginning, but this sort of, he's framing sort of this potential conflict there. And that's something that I want to address from two different perspectives. So, like I said, there's sort of two talks here, and I frame this based on past presentations and the questions that I get and what participants seem to be interested in. And if you're interested in something else, I apologize, but these are the two things that I've sort of focused on. So the first half is sort of addressing the question that sort of is framed by what Benedict just said. So looking at order, chance, and purpose in evolution. And some of this is going to repeat, and I'll skip over, move through that relatively quickly. Some of the stuff that's come up already this week from some philosophy talks. And that's this juxtaposition between evolution as a chance, a random process, although random is not the right word, even though it's often used with evolution, and providential creation. And what I'm going to focus on there is not so much the philosophical arguments, although I'll touch on that, but sort of the better way of viewing evolution is, I think, that evolution is a highly ordered process. And certainly there are chance events that are involved in evolution, but the chance is secondary. It's sort of like Corey Hayes was talking about shooting ducks, right? So the order and purpose of a person deciding to try to shoot a duck uses a chance process to meet an end. And I think that's sort of a better way of looking at it. And how this order not only is essential for evolution to work, but actually influences the direction evolution goes, right? So evolution, in some respects, particularly on the macro level, it can be a bit more predictable than I think than some people would realize. And then the second part of the talk is about human evolution, from hominids to humans. And that's the question of how do you get from a sort of non-rational hominid to a human, someone with an entity like you or me with a rational soul, with rational thought. And what does the fossil record reveal? What does the archaeological record reveal? How do you fit that in there? And how do you reconcile that, say, with things like original sin and monogenism and polygenism? That'd be the second half of the talk. So that's what I'm going to try to do this morning. So the first thing is to sort of set in context so the Catholic understanding of creation, of providential creation, as far as it relates to man. And I'm not going to go too much into this, but I just want to hit on two key things that are important to keep in mind as we talk about how evolution works, right? And then it's easier to see how these things might fit together. So the two things, and you could have a whole lecture on, providential creation, but the two things that I want to focus on are up here. The first is that we owe our existence to God, that God deliberately intended to create us, right? That it is not the sense that there is an evolutionary process going on that was, filled with chance events, and God looked down, 200,000 years ago and saw some hairless hominid running around in Africa and said, well, that's pretty cool. Well, maybe I'll give that thing a rational soul. Maybe that's what we should do. But no, from all eternity, that was, God knew that we were going to be here, you and I specifically. That is a truth of the faith. And to keep that in mind as we're thinking through evolution, right? The second is that God created man in his image. And in that sense, that frames what we should expect from the science of evolution, right? So when we talk about God creating man in his image, we recognize, the church recognizes that that man is more than a material being, right? That man is a unity of body and soul. So if we expect the science of evolution to explain everything there is to know about man, then we're asking it to do more than it is capable of doing. We're asking science to do something that science is not capable of doing. If there is, in fact, an immaterial aspect to man, then science will not be able to explain its origin, explain how that works, and so forth, okay? But we do know we are a physical being as well, and so that means science does have much to say about what it means to become human and how we became human, and that's something to keep in mind, okay? So those are the sort of the 2 points to keep in mind as we move through now, starting to talk about evolution, okay? So evolution from a scientific perspective here. I always frame this with students as sort of 3 levels of evolution, and talk about just briefly that each level it requires a different set of evidence to establish, but it's usually the last level, the level at the top that causes people most concern. Right? So it's kind of like a wedding cake that you see there on the. Not good with rights and lefts, especially when I'm backwards. On the right, where you have at the bottom, the base of the cake, is historical evolution. That's just the evidence that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, that there's been different organisms. If you go back and look at rocks that are 1 billion years old, you're going to find a different set of organisms than you did 500 million years ago, as opposed to 100 million years. And so there's one set of evidence that can build upon that. And once you have that evidence, then you can move on to the next level, which is common descent, that all of those organisms that you find in the fossil record are somehow related via common descent. They're all on one sort of evolutionary tree. And then there's a different set of evidence looking at commonalities and sort of the patterns in which you find the fossils that would support that. Okay? The last level, the one at the top of the cake, again, requires the other 2 to be well supported, is what I call Darwinian evolution, which is the mechanism. How does this all happen? What drove this? What is the process that allowed for organisms to change over time? And I call it Darwinian evolution, but really it's a little bit more than that. There's other natural mechanisms, but it's how to, using natural mechanisms to explain how organisms changed over time, with natural selection being sort of the main driver. Okay? Now, it's at this level where people, see. We talked about this before. If natural selection can explain something, then that rules God out of the picture, and we'll get to that in a minute. But let's look just briefly at what natural selection really is, and so we can sort of understand what it can and what it doesn't do. Okay. So natural selection works on populations, right? So people that are biologists, I'm sure you teach this in your classes, right? That natural selection doesn't work necessarily on individuals, but works on populations. It allows populations to change over time as individuals in those populations have different reproductive fitnesses, right? So for natural selection to operate, you have basically just sort of 3 simple things that have to occur, although there's many things that influence that, right? So the first is that individuals within the population have to vary, which is quite self-evident to anybody that looks around at any animal, plant, bacterial population. And the second is that some of that variability is heritable, which is also relatively easy to demonstrate, although obviously there's other things that affect your phenotype, just the environment and the nurture versus nature. But there is, for most traits, a genetic component that's heritable. Right? The last thing is that some individuals in each generation are better at surviving and reproducing because of that heritable trait, right? That's going to cause changes in the population over time, right? That individual is not going to change. The individual is going to be relatively stable throughout their lifespan, but they might be able to survive longer, have more offspring, and that would change the next generation. So you get something there on the right where you see population 1 at the top. You have these giraffes with the different sized necks. over time, if there's selection for larger necks, because that allows you to have more offspring, the arrow on the bottom, you have a population has changed over time so that you have a population with a greater, larger neck size. Okay. So what then sort of affects an organism's form, right? What is it? Because that's what's really being selected for or against. The organism's form, its structure, its shape, its behaviors, and what natural selection is doing. And natural selection is not a thing. It's an emergent process, right? And I'll talk about that on the next slide. But the natural selection doesn't necessarily build the forms. The forms are built through other mechanisms. And natural selection in that process sort of calls and selects for optimal forms for a given environment. Okay? But there's a lot of other things that help drive change in form over time, right? Now, most people think, well, natural selection is driven just by mutations, right? And certainly mutations, changes in your genetics, can cause changes in your form, right? And so I have that genetic changes up there in italics, okay? But there's all these other factors that particularly over the last 20 years, that people have identified that play a role in shaping form that are more than just sort of genetic mutations. There are other sort of emergent things, right? The first is, I'll just talk about just a couple of them. If you have questions afterwards, I'd be happy to go over them. But the point that I want to make is that there's other things that affect the form. They are natural processes, though. So Evo Devo is this idea, and it's well sort of documented, that small changes in early development can lead to large changes in the phenotype of the organism. And which is something that, so you can see on the right, there's a B and C. There's a small change that leads in these fish to two new bones forming in purple. You can see them, the bones, all the way to the right under C, right? And it's one small mutation that does that. And you might think, well, that's not going to work. You just throw two new bones into a limb, nothing's going to fit right. But the way limbs develop, that you just need one mutation there to do that. And the blood vessels, because of the way the blood vessels form, they aren't directed necessarily by the genes, they're directed by the environment. They form where there's low levels of oxygen. And so they'll invade and form blood vessels. You'll have muscle attachments that will form through finding these bones through other signals that will crop up. So you don't need a whole bunch of sort of sequential mutations to have like a very large scale change because of sort of the robustness, what's called facilitated variation. That a lot of things aren't specified by the gene. You think of your brain, right? Your brain, what happens is that you have a bunch of neurons that go out and make tons of connections, and then after you're born, you get rid of all the ones you don't need, right? So it's not so much specified that I need this connection so I can tell, what a dog is, or I need this connection to be able to sense smell. But you form a lot of connections and you pair back based on experience. And that's sort of what goes on during limb development. You form a bunch of connections, you pair back to where you don't need blood vessels and so forth. Another one down there, epigenetics, is one where what will happen during your lifespan based on your behaviors, your diet, and so forth, you can affect how genes in the sperm or the egg are imprinted, turned on or shut off, and those can be inherited. So the offspring could have certain versions of a gene that's the same, it hasn't mutated, but it's no longer turned on, or it's turned on to more than in someone else, which can cause changes in phenotypes over time. So there's other things that can do this to build the phenotype that natural selection is going to work on. Okay. But when we look at natural selection, it emerges, right, from a whole network of relationships, and some of these we'll talk about a little bit more. So I have, the organism in the middle, because the organism is what is being selected for or against, right? And it's the object of selection. And you can see what are the things that affect the organism's fitness, right? So two things affect it sort of in a one-way direction, right? And that's the chemical and physical laws of the universe, right? So the organism can't escape those. Right? It has to operate under chemical and physical constraints. It can't change the force of gravity. It can't change the density of water, for example. It can't change how carbon atoms bond. It has to, those are sort of things that it's going to have to deal with. Those are selective forces that it has to deal with constantly. And it can't, the arrow is only in one direction. It can't change gravity. It can't change those things. And that plays a big role, we'll see when we talk about the order in the universe, because that has a big job of directing evolution, I think, and we'll talk about that in a few slides. But the other arrows are in two directions, right? So the organism is going to be affected by the other species in the environment, but it also affects those species. It's a two-way street. The same thing with other members of its species. Environmental factors, abiotic factors, the temperature, the environment, and so forth, the nature of the environment. But the organism also can affect its environment with niche construction, where beavers obviously modify their environment, and that changes the selective pressures on them. So it's a dynamic thing that changes the environment from generation to generation, the selective pressures. And one of the things I always tell my students, or ask them about this, so they sort of see how dynamic and how this changes, is it's hard to think of a trait. Can you think of a trait that would always, in every circumstance, be beneficial? I don't think there is one, because any trait you come up with, you can say, well, if the environment shifted this way, it would no longer be beneficial. And it's just sort of see that this is really context dependent to a large extent. The example of sort of the giraffes over there, and the question of why does a giraffe have a long neck, right? There's a lot of sort of factors that go in and affect selective pressures on giraffes. And if you ask most students, they say, well, the reason giraffes have a long neck is because they have to eat leaves that are high up on the tree. Right? Well, it turns out that's not why, currently, with giraffes, that's not the main selective pressure that keeps their necks long. Right? And so you see on that slide, this is one of the, a tedious purgatory for a grad student. And what they had to do is be out in the field, and they watched male and female giraffes eat, and they had to check at what height were they eating the leaves. And so the blue stuff there, that's the frequency. So you see the females to the right, almost all the leaves they ate were below their head. They were bending down to eat. Okay? And the interesting, when they bent down to eat, there was, even when they ate leaves from the top of the tree, there was still plenty of leaves below, right? So it didn't seem to be that they needed the long neck to eat. But what they did find is that they did need, the males use the long neck to fight other males, right? So I had a video here. I don't know how to play it, but I'm not going to worry. But they come out, they usually sort of whip their head. And they fracture their skull doing this, and so obviously the longer my neck would be, my neck's decent size. I might be able to take on a giraffe. But the longer the neck, the more force you can get, the more damage you can do to the other male. So the ones with the longer necks would be able to mate with more females. And that seems to be what is maintaining, at least currently, the long neck in giraffes. Now, that doesn't mean that's how it evolved. It could have evolved because, back when giraffes emerged, they may have needed the long neck, may have been a key for feeding. It doesn't seem to be the case at this point, but it's maintained. And so you could see sort of the chance elements that go into this, right? So maybe there's a chance mutation that occurs that or environmental change that occurs that there's a reduction in the male population in the giraffes. Then the selective pressure for fighting other males might drop, right? And so over time, you might have a shorter neck might be more beneficial because you're not wasting all these resources building a large neck. There's a lot of a lot of changes that have to occur, and changes in blood pressure to pump the blood all the way up to the head and so forth. So there are a lot of chance environmental things that can happen that can switch the selective pressure, and there's also a lot of chance mutations that can happen that affect natural selection. So chance does play a large role in this. Okay? And that leads to this argument that I think that Benedict was getting at the first slide, right? And that is that the argument that you often hear from people is that, well, evolution must be without a plan or purpose. Because at its core mechanism, natural selection of phenotypes, and it selects for phenotypes that occur via chance. There's chance things that generate your phenotype, right? And are influenced by chance events within the environment, right? So you think of, like major extinction events at the Permian. There's the Siberian traps where you have this huge volcanic eruption as being a chance event it's not as if those erupted to get rid of all these species. They just happen to erupt. They're doing what volcanoes do, right? Or the meteor that hit the Yucatan Peninsula probably 66 million years ago that triggered another mass extinction, right? So those are sort of chance events that fuel evolution. And so there is this sort of a dichotomy then that's at the heart of sort of evolutionary biology and sort of understanding of Catholic theology. So there's two issues here that I want to talk about. The first one I'll talk about very briefly because other speakers have talked about that, and that there's a philosophical need to integrate chance and providence within evolution, but that's not something that's unique to evolution. And that's one of the things that I'm always struck by, that students will have a problem trying to figure out how do you reconcile chance in evolution with purpose when there's chance events going on. You are a chance event, right? The sperm and egg that brought you together. So the church has dealt with this issue of how you reconcile providence and chance for millennia. It's nothing new with evolution, right? But what I want to focus on is number two, and that's that evolution really is an interplay of order and chance. And I want to get to how that order sort of shapes and directs evolution here. Okay, but just briefly, that philosophical thing, just going over it again, the idea that God as primary cause of everything that exists is on a different level. He's not competing with these other things. And so like chance events, natural selection, human action, all of those things only occur because God has allows and sustains those in creation. We've already talked about this, so I'll skip over that. But I do want to hit on this quote because I think this illustrates this providence and chance reconciliation, particularly in relation to evolution. And this is from Ern McMullen. He says, it makes no difference whether the appearance of Homo sapiens is the inevitable result of a steady process of complexification stretching out over billions of years, or whether, on the contrary, it comes through a series of coincidences that would have been entirely unpredictable from the causal human standpoint. So he's saying it doesn't matter if evolution had to run this way, that it was totally predictable, and then you could predict every little step, or if there's a large amount of contingency and chance. It doesn't matter from the perspective of providence. And he says, because either way, the outcome is God's making. From the biblical standpoint, it could properly be said to be God's plan. He said terms like plan obviously shift meaning when the element of time is absent. For God to plan is for the outcome to occur, right? So God being outside of time, and Corey talked about this, somebody asked him the question, is there a chance with God? And he said, no. Right? And that's the point. God is not bound in time with us, where he's going along, this is a chance event. God knows everything that's going to happen and allows everything to happen. So using the term chance with God doesn't make any sense. And we see this in human interactions, that chance always depends upon one's perspective and what knowledge one has, right? For example, if I arrange, my son's 22, I want him to meet a good Catholic woman, so I call my friend who has a 22-year-old daughter, and I say, hey, why don't you send your daughter to Kroger, the grocery store, to the milk aisle, and get some milk at 5 o'clock, And so they both bump into each other in the milk aisle, very romantic place to be, and they hit it off. And from their perspective, this was a chance encounter. They just bumped into each other. But from my perspective and my friend's perspective, well, that was that was ordained. And again, that. But you can see from a human perspective what's chance for one person isn't for another because of the person and the lack of knowledge. And all analogies fail to some extent, but that's sort of how you can see God being outside of time. There isn't this thing of chance for God. It's really a human thing being stuck inside time. But we've talked about that, so I'll just move on from that and get to the second part. Okay, so the second issue that I want to talk about with chance and order is that evolution really is an interplay between order and chance. And I want to make 2 points through these next few slides. The first point is that this order is absolutely essential for evolution to work. And evolution doesn't create this order. Natural selection doesn't produce it. It's a gift, in a sense, to the evolutionary process. That's number one, right? And I think what Steve Barr talked about in his lecture sort of resonates with what I'll say about that. The second thing that I would like to argue is that order actually influences and directs evolution down certain pathways, and it makes evolution somewhat predictable. All right, although there is, I'm not saying there isn't chance events and so forth, but that it influences and directs the outcome of evolution. Okay? So the first is that this order is essential for evolution to work. So you think about, why does evolution work at all? Right? When I say that, why does natural selection work? Why do we live in a universe in which you can have natural selection operating, right? For natural selection to operate, you have to have stable organisms, stable complex entities that can be selected for or against, right? So we just so happen to live in that type of universe, right? So if you look at this slide, that's a picture of me from like 10 years ago. And it doesn't look too much different from me right now. I'm relatively physically stable. You can debate whether I'm mentally stable, but that you could look at that picture, you recognize, well, that's me, right? I have more gray hair and less hair in general, but you could say, well, that's me. I've been relatively a stable organism that can be selected over time, right? From a natural selection perspective. The question is, why am I a stable organism, right? And why are you a stable organism? Well, largely because the molecules that make you up are relatively stable. So the proteins that make me up, and there's more than just proteins, are relatively stable molecules, right? Now they do misfold, and you have to manage them, but they don't just flip in and out of from one form to another constantly. They're relatively stable, right? And that's what you see in this picture, okay? But the question is, why are those stable, right? Those are stable because of the atoms that make them up are stable, right? And those atoms are, like a carbon atom is a carbon atom is a carbon atom. You know, the carbon in, the CO2 is the same as the carbon that was in the sugar that you ate and so forth. The carbon just doesn't change its structure. Unless, it takes a lot of energy to get one atom to change into another atom. Like I think of nuclear fission or fusion. So why are those atoms stable, right? So there's only about, it depends how you define it, 80 to 90 stable atoms. Right? There's more stable isotopes, but if you look at the periodic table, why does it end? After 90, you get these, anything above 90 starts to become relatively unstable and then becomes relatively short-lived, right? So why is it that we only have these, right? Well, the reason that only those atoms are stable is because of the subatomic forces and the sort of the order of the physics at the foundational level that Steve was talking about the other day. So if you change, the order here, right? That order there is absolutely essential to get those elements there and to get those elements in a certain proportion, which is actually essential for getting proteins to form, which is then essential for organisms. But there's a huge amount of order here, right? That Steve talked about. And if you change that, modify that, then you get a universe that only can make hydrogen, right? Which you're never going to get anything on the left side of this slide, okay? So that order is not something that natural selection produces. That order is something that's just there. And you get to a level where you can't explain it. You get to the foundational level where physicists can explain that order, but they can't explain why it is ordered in that way, right? And that order is essential. And I think physicists often appreciate it because they study that order. Biologists don't often appreciate that. I think because they don't study that order, they just assume that. Okay. So the second point, which I think, though, is probably even more interesting about this order, is that this order actually influences the direction in which evolution goes. You'll swig of cold coffee there. All right, so we talked about this, I think, yesterday. We were talking about the idea of what would happen if you could rerun the tape of evolution on Earth, right? So if you had 100 different Earths that you could watch, and let's see what happens, what evolves. And you have two extreme sort of possibilities, right? So you have the one extreme is that you would get totally new organisms and worlds in every single iteration. It's the idea that evolution is totally contingent, that this chance is what's really key, and that the chance events that would occur would drive evolution in a totally different direction. And there's the late Stephen Jay Gould, who was a paleontologist at Harvard, is sort of one of the major proponents of this sort of extreme. Right? On the other extreme is this idea that the universe, that evolution is extremely convergent. That if we reran the tape again, 100 different times, what you would get wouldn't be identical, but you get a lot of similar things again. It wouldn't look that different from iteration to iteration. The pattern of when things might emerge might be totally different because there'd be different cataclysmic events that might have occurred, and so the timing might be different, but you would still get very similar organisms. And there is, on that end, this highly convergent idea, and that's Simon Conway Morris, who I talked about yesterday, I think Father did, sort of the main proponent of that extreme. Now, the reality is that they're both extremes. It's something, the reality is probably somewhere in between. But I think that the reality would be closer to the convergent side. And why? Why do I think that? Well, you can't do that, rerun the tape of evolution again. But what you can do is look at what happened during this iteration of evolution and see what occurred. Right? Are there things that keep evolving multiple times that Corey talked about yesterday? Okay, and what you see, and this is the book from Conway Morris that I would recommend anybody that's interested in this, is that evolution is highly, highly convergent. It's hard to find any structure, behavior that hasn't evolved more than once, right? So if you look at like multicellularity, that's evolved multiple times, right? If you look at powered flight, multiple times. The fusiform body of aquatic species has evolved multiple times, right? Echolocation has evolved multiple times. It's hard to find anything that hasn't evolved multiple times. And so the idea that there's certain things that work here on Earth that if you reran evolution again, right, electromagnetic radiation is a great way to make energy. Something's going to evolve to be able to capture that energy in photosynthesis, right? Something's going to evolve to be able to see, to be able to absorb light, to use that for how to get around. In a three-dimensional world, a body that's bilaterally symmetrical is a great way to make to move in the environment. So you don't see if you reran evolution again, you would get some bilaterally symmetrical organisms, right? So this is the idea that the physics and the chemistry of the Earth, right, that don't vary. Every time you reran evolution, you still have to deal with the physics and chemistry is going to be the same. You would get very similar structures, very similar organisms that would come out the other end. Okay? And I think the one example that I'll give here is protein evolution, because I think this is probably the best example of convergence that you can come up with. And it focuses on the chemistry and physics, which would be the same. If you reran the tape of evolution, you'd still have to do, the chemistry and physics isn't going to change, right? So just a quick overview of protein biology, right? So proteins are made of amino acids. So in this picture, you've got, each one of these little colored balls is an amino acid, and in biological organisms, there's about 20 amino acids that are biologically relevant. There's a lot more amino acids, but there's 20 that you find in proteins. And every protein is a string of these amino acids, right? And the sequence of amino acids is called the primary sequence of the protein. And there's, if you think about it, how many possible primary sequences are there for a proteins of 100 amino acids of length? And those are pretty small proteins, right? it would be 20 to the 100th power, right? So you could have any one of the 20 at position 1, any of the 20 at position 2. So it's a huge number, right? So there's this just sort of vast array of primary protein sequences, right? But proteins fold into secondary and tertiary structures. So proteins to work, not all of them, but a good majority of proteins to work properly have to fold into a defined three-dimensional structure. So you would think, well, there's almost an infinite number of primary sequences. There'd be an infinite number of structures that they could fold into, right? Which would be sort of one's sort of first intuition. Well, when proteins fold, if they do fold, some don't, but if they do, they fold into only 2 secondary structures, right? Regardless of what their amino acid sequence is. And you can see them up here. One is called an alpha helix, this thing over, that thing here, and then a beta sheet, this thing here. And the reason they fold into those is because of the underlying chemistry. It allows them to keep their backbone away from water and then have their sort of side groups stick out into either the membrane or into the water. But that is a thermodynamically favorable way of, you string amino acids together and you put them into water. That is the thermodynamically favorable way for them to fold, right? So if you rerun evolution again and you have proteins, they're going to fold into alpha helices and beta sheets because they have the same thermodynamic, the same hydrophobic, hydrophilic interactions, right? And then these alpha helices and beta sheets, they can be arranged, wait, where's my, there we go, into tertiary structures. You could mix them up into different what are called protein folds. So on this slide, what you can see is the blue are the alpha helices, the pink are the beta sheets, and each one of those is considered a protein fold. And there's only about 1,000 protein folds that have been identified in naturally occurring proteins. So normally, when somebody crystallizes a protein, figures out the protein structure, they load it into the it's an international protein database, and it will compare it to all the proteins that are in there and say, oh, no, that's a structure we've already found. And I think it's been about 20 years since a new fold has been found, right? So every time somebody crystallizes a new protein, oh, that matches one that we've already found. So it seems that there's a very limited number of folds that are possible because there's only a certain number of ways you can arrange alpha helices and beta sheets, again, based on chemical rules and so forth. So this is, we live in this very highly ordered universe as described by modern physics, and I would hopefully convince you this order is essential for evolution to work, and this order influences the outcome of evolution. Particularly if you look at protein evolution. I think if you reran evolution again, you would get very similar shaped proteins. Their sequences would be quite different, their amino acid sequence, but their shapes would be very, very similar because there's only certain shapes that are really stable. Okay. But that shows that convergence there. And that order is, I think, primary, and that the chance events are sort of like ways to uncover that order. So it's a good search algorithm to find sort of the islands of fitness that sort of exist out there based on the chemistry and physics of our universe. Okay, so that was the first part of the talk. The second part is going to look at human evolution from hominids to humans. And sort of 3 things here if we have time to look at. The first is to discuss the distinction that I'll make and that people have made between biological humans and theological humans. And what does that mean, and why do people make that distinction? And how do you sort of uncover those in the fossil record? How do you identify biological humans in the fossil record? Excuse me, how do you identify theological humans? And look at the origin. Where do you find the first biological humans? Where might you find the first theological humans? Right. And then if we have time to look at the issue of monogenism and polygenism, those questions came up, I think, in discussion the other day, that one of the discussion seminars that I was in. Okay, so what do I mean by biological versus theological humans, right? And then how might you identify those in the fossil record? Right? So when we talk about biological humans, we're talking about a a species that is similar to you and I, that has a form, a structure that you would identify, and it has the brain size of modern humans, has the skull shape of modern humans, it has the anatomy, right? So in the fossil record, you would say, based on the anatomical characteristics, this thing is a biologically modern human, right? And a lot of times in papers they'll call it anatomically modern human, AMH, right? That's what we're talking about with a biological human, right? When you talk about theological humans, you're talking about something that is made in the image and likeness of God, right? Something that has a rational soul, that has rationality, that has the ability for symbolic thought and conceptual thought, right? So that's the distinction, right, between the two. Now, they certainly could overlap. It could be possible that every biological human is a theological human. It could be that they might not overlap, okay? It might be that they're theological humans and biological humans. There's other organisms that are theologically human, all right? So we'll get into that as we go through the slides here. But how would you identify these in the fossil record? Well, both of them, it's difficult, all right? So even the first, with the biological humans, you're going to identify them by the form, right? And particularly the brain size and the brain shape, right? But as we'll see, that there's a lot of debate about that, and there's a lot of variability, that it's kind of hard to unambiguously categorize things. Right? Now, when it gets to theological humans, it becomes even more difficult because there is no, the soul doesn't fossilize, right? And behaviors don't necessarily fossilize, but the effects of behaviors, artifacts, do show up in the archaeological record. And there's certain things that if you see a majestic cave painting there on the right, on the bottom, and if I found that, I would say, well, that must be a theological human. That's somebody that's conceptual, rational thought, must have made that. That's not going to be made by, someone without a spiritual soul, right? That's something that requires rationality, right? So there is ways that you can sort of put upper or lower limits on these things in the fossil record, although then there's obviously debates that come up we'll talk about. Okay. So when we talk about hominin evolution, right? So what is that? Hominin evolution is all the species. So you see here about 7 million years ago, you have a common ancestor, and on one branch give rise to modern chimps and pygmy chimps over here, and on this branch, the only living member on this branch now are modern humans. But any species that's on this branch here that's closer to modern humans than is to modern chimps is considered a hominin. And so that's what we're talking about, is hominin evolution. So what happened along this branch here? Right? And I usually, you have to really oversimplify this because there's so many caveats that go here. But in broad strokes, I think it's best to look at it as sort of three phases, right? From 7 million years to about 4 million years at the base of this tree. There isn't that much, particularly 6 million years ago. There isn't much in terms of early hominid in the fossil record. There's a few that you find in Africa, right? And then from 4 million to 2 million, you have a huge amount of different forms that you find. The Australopithecus lineages, like the famous Lucy fossil, and then you see the beginnings of our genus Homo. And you can see here on this picture, you can see here's a bunch of these fossils between 4 and about 2 million years. And so you see this, what's called African diversification. You see a lot of different hominid fossils showing up in Africa. And what you find, it's more like a bushy tree. It's a sort of a mosaic evolution. It isn't like the bumper sticker there up on the top, where you have, this gradually standing up, and it's a clear lineage. A goes to B, goes to C, goes to D. It's very mosaic, where you see some species look more modern in their skull, but they look more ancient in their skeleton, where others look more modern in their skeleton and more ancient in their skull. So it's obviously not, and you can see that's why there's all these question marks in these connections here. But up until this time, everything is in Africa. All right, all the hominids are there. And then from 2 million years out, that's when things get even more interesting, because that's when you start to get waves of hominids leaving Africa and moving throughout the globe. And it is in one of those waves out of Africa that modern humans emerge. Okay. So when we look at the waves out of Africa, this is what you see. So the first wave of hominids that leave Africa is Homo erectus. Right? And Homo erectus emerges in Africa roughly 2 million years ago. And some people call the Homo erectus in Africa ergaster. Some people split those into two species. But the erectus that leave head through the Levant into Asia, particularly East Asia. And they are there, or their ancestors are there, species that are derived from up until about 20,000 years ago. There's some small sort of hobbit species that was found in Indonesia about 10 years ago that was dated to about 20,000 years. But that's sort of the first wave out of Africa. The second wave is the Neanderthals. And the Neanderthals left Africa somewhere around 500,000 years ago into the Levant, the Caucasus, and then into Europe. Right? And then there was other related species that went further east. But that's sort of the second wave out. Now, the last wave was modern humans, right? Homo sapiens. And they start to show up outside of Africa roughly around 100,000 years ago. Right? But so the major wave is thought to be about 60,000 to 50,000 years, where modern humans leave Africa and quickly spread throughout the rest of the globe. They seem to show up in Australia very, very shortly after. So they get pretty far very, very quickly. So these modern humans, right, where do you find them first? You find them first in Africa, and then they spread throughout the globe. So when you're looking for biological humans, where are the oldest? Right? The oldest are these fossils that were found in Morocco about 300,000 years ago. Right? Up until that time, this was a find, I think it was 4 years ago when these were published. But up until that time, the oldest were 200,000 years ago in East Africa, in Ethiopia. But both of these tend to be considered anatomically modern humans, although there are some subtle differences, and this is what I want to point out. So I blow up this slide here. So if you look to the right in C and D, ignore A and B, those are Neanderthal skulls. But if you look at C and D, D is a relatively modern human skull. So I think that one is dated to 20,000 years ago, and it's very much indistinguishable from the skull that I'll use in an anatomy lab for a human anatomy course. But the C there, that is the fossil skull from the modern human that was found in Morocco. It's 300,000 years old, right? The brain size is about the same, but what you can see is there's a difference in brain shape and the brow ridge. So this one here is sort of a little flat. It's almost squeezed here. This one is more globular, right? And this one has a more prominent brow ridge than modern human. Modern human has slightly, the more recent one has a slightly flatter face. So there are anatomical differences. And so, it's not unambiguous that is a modern human. It might be, a slightly different. Most people argue it's a modern human, right? But this is the point to recognize when you're just looking at these fossils. There isn't a clear line of guidance. Well, I know if it gets to this, it has to be modern human, right? There is some subjectivity there, and in trying to classify these things. So it's not always straightforward to determine that something is biologically human. But we do know that the oldest that are close to that are found in Africa, right? So at least 200,000 years ago, possibly 300,000 years ago. Okay. Now, when those humans left Africa, right, they encountered other hominid species, and particularly the one that's probably most studied is the Neanderthals that they encountered. Okay, so as they left Africa, and particularly, the big wave was about 50 to 60,000 years ago, but it wasn't like there's this big gate there, and put the gate up, and you can go out now. There's people moving back and forth constantly, but there was a major migration, it seems, around 50,000 years. But humans were moving into the Neanderthal or modern humans, maybe 120 and 100,000 years ago, into the Levant in the Middle East there, and encountered Neanderthals. And particularly the wave that left at 50 to 60,000 years ago encountered them. Okay? And there's good evidence that those humans that did leave, those modern humans, biological humans, interbred with Neanderthals, right? And so if you look at Neanderthal DNA, we're able to, the sequence of Neanderthal DNA, and look at DNA from different human populations, what you find is somewhere between, from every individual is going to be slightly different, but roughly around 2 to 3% of the DNA seems to have come from Neanderthals, these integration of Neanderthal DNA into the human lineage, except for Africans, right? Which would make sense is that the African human population did not interact with Neanderthals because Neanderthals didn't move into Africa and the African population stayed in Africa. It's all non-African populations. Those are the ones that left Africa would have mated with Neanderthals and picked up some alleles, right? And the alleles are different. They're all different types of things. It's not just, this one gene is Neanderthal. There's different alleles. And you would think that they might be alleles that are beneficial for living in a colder climate, for example. The Neanderthals have been in this other climate, that for a longer period of time. There might be genes that they have that would be beneficial for modern humans as they interacted with them. There's other hominid species that humans are thought to have interacted with as well. So these modern humans, is keep in mind that they emerged in Africa, but they're not necessarily reproductively isolated from every other hominid species, right? In terms of their ability. Although, they were, by and large, seemed to, because of their genes, reproductively, they weren't reproductively isolated because they couldn't interbreed, but probably behaviorally, they were probably reproductively, for the most part, isolated, although there were these integration events. Okay? All right. Okay, so let's then look at theological humans, right, and finish with this. So, this is a quote from John Paul II, and he's talking about, how do you identify sort of the crossing of the Rubicon of going from, a hominid to a modern human, a spiritual being, right, a unity of body and spirit. And he says, I'll just use the second quote. He says, the moment of passage into the spiritual realm is not something that can be observed in this way. And he's talking about looking at, quantifying it in the fossil record, right? But he says, although we can nevertheless discern through experimental research a series of very valuable signs of what is specifically human life. And when he's talking about human life there, he's talking about theological humans. And he's referring to the archaeological record, right? So there are certain signs that we could see that we would interpret as being things that must be made or must be brought about by theological humans. So where do you see that? Okay. So just as an overview, and I'll look at a couple slides of some examples. He said the oldest biological humans are 200 to 300,000 years old in Africa. You start to see key signs of human culture about 100,000 years ago. And again, that's a rough estimate. You see some above and below. But what you see is not in one location, right? You see it in multiple places. You see it in South Africa. You see some in East Africa. You actually see some in the Levant, where you start to see jewelry, complex tools, some simple carvings on ochre, and so forth. And so there isn't an obvious, human culture started here, right, at this locale, based on the archaeological record, right? And then at about 50,000 years ago, you see a relative, and I'd say explosion, but you see a distinct change where you see much more complex artifacts like figurines, cave paintings, more composite tools. We have a blade and some adhesive and some string, and you see something that clearly has multiple facets, and it's a more complicated a process of hafting a tool together. Okay. But again, with this, it's not as if you just see it in one place. You see it, initially it was just in Europe. And we thought, well, human culture took off in Europe 40 to 50,000 years ago. But as we see, you see the beginnings of it throughout Africa and the Middle East earlier. And you also see the same cave painting in Indonesia about 40,000 years ago. So these are the type of things you see from 50 to 100,000 years. You see these beads. These are found in Blomberg's cave in South Africa, where you see these little beads, the shells, but they have the holes cut out at a very regular rate, and thought maybe that's jewelry. You have these carvings on the bottom right. That's also from Blomberg's cave. These points up the top, very sort of artistic points. Rather than just a blade, it looks more artistic, that there's some sense of beauty going on there, right? And those are found in East Africa, and similar ones are found in the Levant. Okay? And then this is what you see after 50,000 years, right? And what you see is this is from Indonesia. The other three are from Europe. So this is, again, it's not, again, in one locale. It's spread throughout the globe. And it's hard to argue that whoever made these was not very much like you and I, right? So I think when you look at that record, theological humans must have been around from at least, I would argue, 100,000 years ago, if not sooner, right? And clearly, I think it's hard to argue that they weren't around 50,000 years ago making these advanced sort of paintings and so forth, right? Okay. But what makes matters even a little bit more complicated is that you also have art like this that's attributed to Neanderthals. Okay? So this is a cartoon representation of what is colored here onto the rock. And this is dated to 65,000 years ago. In southern France. And at this point, there is no known, humans had not made it to modern humans hadn't made it here. The only species that's thought to have been here is Neanderthals. Now that might change. There was a paper that came out a few months ago that moved the date of modern humans in Africa, in this portion of Europe back. So before it was 45,000, now it seems to be 50,000. So it's still possible. Maybe this is made by modern humans, but we know Neanderthals were there, and at this point, Neanderthals were the only hominid that was around. So whether this was, just doodling, whether this was Neanderthals with rational conceptual thought, it's debatable. If it was, then I would argue that these Neanderthals would be theologically human. They must be somehow related to us and be theologically human, just like you and I. And that's where we're talking about the distinction between biological humans and theological humans. They don't necessarily have to map on top of each other, right? Okay. We're doing for time. All right. 5 minutes here just to finish up on monogenism and polygenism, and just talk about that in relation to what we've just been talking about, okay? So the big document that discusses monogenism and polygenism. Monogenism is the idea that humans emerge from a single couple and everybody descends from that couple, versus polygenism is the idea that humans emerge from a population and they descended from a population of individuals, right? And this is from Pope Pius XII in Humani Generis, where he talks about this. And he says, the faithful cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him, as from the first parent of all, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents. Okay? And so I think that's the key line there. So he seems to say that polygenism, the idea that there was a population, is not something that you can embrace. He doesn't sort of forbid this. He says you can't embrace this. But I think the key is why. He says, why does he say this? He says, because it's no way apparent how such an opinion can be reconciled with what the sources of revealed truth and the documents of the teaching authority of the church proposed with regard to original sin. Right, so it's not so much that that polygenism is a problem as it is original sin is a key tenet of our understanding of the faith. And so if you could, and a lot of theologians, if you could reconcile polygenism and the teachings of original sin, might be fine. And in fact, some later documents, a document from the International Theological Commission talks about this is about an initial human population and so forth, right? But how do you reconcile this? What's the issue here? Okay, so the biological evidence strongly suggests that humans emerge from a population instead of a single pair, right? Okay, so and the way this is done is looking at the amount of genetic variability there is in the human population and modeling how you get that much variability based on known rates of mutation. And you can then go backwards and say, well, to get the amount of genetic variability that we have in the current human population, given how much mutations occur and so forth and recombination, most estimates, and people do this in different ways, but most estimates say that the human lineage could never have passed through a bottleneck of less than about 10,000, although some get down to 1,000, but somewhere in that range, that you would need at least 1,000 human individuals within the last 500,000 years. You couldn't have gone below that to get the genetic diversity that we see in the human population right now. So how do you reconcile that with the idea that we've inherited, sort of our original sin through an original couple? Okay. There's a variety of ways I think this might be able to be done. I think one of the most ingenious and one that I like, and again, I just want to point out that we'll never probably know the answer to this, right? So this is something that's sort of going to forever beyond the veil of history. But I think it's interesting, and it's helpful to give students some ways of thinking about it. I'm not saying that these are correct, this is how it happened, but it helps them, okay, well, maybe that might make sense. And this is one that I tend to like. And this was put forth by Kenneth Kemp, who's a philosopher. And I have the reference for that down there at the bottom if one wants to pull up the article. But his argument is this, and he uses the distinction of biological and theological humans, right? So he argues that, he's not really arguing, he's just giving a sort of an example of how this might work. He argues that there's a population of biological humans, okay? And that's in generation 1. And of those, there's some change that occurs, some physical change in the zygote or of two individuals, the ones in black there, such that they become the type of thing that is normally endowed by God with a rational soul. They are theological humans. There's something slightly different from them. It doesn't have to be a major difference, but there's some slightly difference of their physical makeup, that they are the type of thing that God, like you and I, that would be endowed in the normal course of things with a rational soul. Okay, so they then are in this population, but they have rationality, right? They're different, but they can mate with anybody in the population. They're still biologically human, right? So they have offspring here, but first let's say they fall, right? So they've turned away from God. They have offspring there in black. Those offspring then mate with biological, non-theological humans, right? So that's where sort of the genetic diversity comes in. They're getting the genetic diversity from this pool. And as long as you have one theological human parent, they give rise to offspring that are theologically human because of the physical, the DNA or whatever they pass on is the type of thing that is a theological human. And over time, the theological humans you would expect would take over the population because they have rational thought, right? But as they do, they're incorporating the genetic diversity from a larger population. So everybody that is black down there is directly descendant of that individual first couple, but they're also getting genetic diversity from others in the population. And so this distinction between biological and theological humans, I think, allows for an understanding. Whether it's happened this way, I don't know, but there's other ways I think that you could think about this. But I just put that there to think about. All right. And to end, I just want to see, there's a lot of open questions here. So I'm just sort of framing sort of the boundaries here of what we know. This could all change over the next 2-3 years as more fossils are found, more archaeological digs are found, and it changes at a remarkably rapid pace. And there's a lot of debate in this field because it's difficult to interpret fossils. It's difficult to interpret art, right? Is this art, made by Neanderthals? Is it, there's all kinds of acrimonious debates over whether Neanderthals buried their dead. And you have people on both sides of the issue, and so these things, as you find more sites, you might find better evidence one way or the other. But St. John Paul II says, does an evolutionary perspective bring any light to bear upon theological anthropology, the meaning of the human person as the imago Dei? And I think it does, in a sense that the more we understand evolution in relation to our understanding, we're always viewing it through our understanding of the human person that we talked about at the beginning. It can help us understand how we are the way we are. Why do we have certain tendencies? Why do we have, because we share sort of a physiology and so forth of these other hominids that roam the globe. And so that dictates what it really, a large extent, what it is for what our shared human experience is a large part our biology. And that can help us understand what it means to be human. And it can enlighten our theological understanding of God and creation. How does God work in nature and in creation as well? So thanks for your attention. I'll end there and take questions.